Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And we're just ready to begin. Thank you.
Find your thing.
I don't like doing that. God, I'm always wanted to do that.
Yeah, good.
How about that?
Fantastic.
That's a trick.
That's fantastic. I've always wanted to do that. Thank you all very much for coming to another afternoon session after a really good morning session and keeping up the enthusiasm of this commission. This afternoon, we're going to talk about working together to end homelessness. And as I said at the briefing this morning, what's really important about that is how do we work together? How are we going to collaborate together among our different networks to do something about ending homelessness? So I'm looking forward to this afternoon session with our panel, and we hope with everybody in conversation about something that's really important to us. I want to say one thing, as I said this morning. We talk a lot about homelessness and those who are homeless, but we're talking about people. That's really important, that we're all part of this story, and I'm sure all of us have our own individual stories of being out of home in ourselves. We all have an experience. I know my own. I've had many experiences when I'm not at home within myself, and I'm not different to anybody else. Some people are looking for a house and support, and that's where I come in. So we're talking about people that have unique stories and that will be part of our solution. So as we begin this afternoon, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Daniela Ba, who's the Director of Division for Inclusive Social Development at UNDESA. And I really want to say, Daniela, as I have this opportunity, to thank you for your leadership, both yourself and your team, that have led us to where we are today. And I personally can say that Daniela had an open door, and that's really what homelessness is about. You're invited in somewhere, and you've put a lot of energy into this commission, and it will be successful because of your commitment. So thank you very much, and I hand over to you, Daniela.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Can I share these compliments with Amin, who is always there, doing lots of work. Because he has been working day and night, and I can really say day and night. I can show you the emails that come in and out at night. Also on weekends, his wife one day, I mean, you don't know that, but your wife, Adriana, one day she stopped me and said, Daniela, I mean, please, I don't even know if he's my husband anymore. I mean, on weekends, he's working there on videos and social media and everything. So thank you very much, I mean. It is a real honor for me to be here this afternoon. It has been an honor to go to most of the events, and actually all of the events we had so far. But if it wouldn't have been for Unanima and also for the Global Homelessness, IGH, I honestly think that maybe this conference, the Commission for Social Development, wouldn't have been so successful. You have been extremely instrumental. You have provided us advice. You have galvanized the social, the community, other stakeholders. You have provided us with names of amazing speakers. So you have moderated very complex panels. So I really, really wish to thank you very much. If it wouldn't have been a united effort, we are at the United Nations, but here I would like to say united efforts of all of you, we wouldn't have achieved such an amazing result. And I do hope that next year, no matter what the priority theme is going to be, we will work united as we have done this year. I experimented, but only for very few days, a feeling that resembles homelessness. And we go back in 1975, I think. Yes, I was 15 years old. I come from northeast of Italy. And back in those years, there was a horrifying earthquake that destroyed the whole area. That part of northeast of Italy was completely destroyed. And most of the houses were shaken down like crumbs on earth. And I remember, there we have the Alps, it's mountains. And a big mountain, because of the epicentro, how do you say epicenter? Yes, I know. I have so many meetings. Leave me in peace. Was right there under one of these mountains, and the mountain opened and collapsed on itself. Wow. So I was very lucky because my parents, our family, was not up to the mountains, but nearby the sea. So there, the waves don't have this movement, but have this movement. So it absorbs somehow the waves. But for a few days, we were sleeping in the car. So it is nothing compared to the issue we have been discussing these days. But I imagined myself when one of the speakers in the panel you moderated asked, and he went through homelessness. He said, "What would you do if it were your family we're talking about?" So it's, he really tried for all of us to feel what we're talking about, not just to talk about people, in homelessness, but how would you feel? And that question brought me back this memory of, when I was 15 or 16 years old, when for a few days we slept in the car. Sorry, it has nothing to do and everything to do actually with the meeting of today, but working together, united to end homelessness. I think that this is actually what we want to achieve today in terms of commitment. There is a decade of action. So what kind of actions do we want to take? I would like to say to the year 2030 and beyond. The beyond has to be there. I have something in my office that I like very much. It's framed and it says, "Go as far as you can go, and once there, you will see further." So I want to see further the year 2030, okay? That's what has to drive our event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Apologies.
Oh, sure.
Colleagues of UN Habitat, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And rightly so to acknowledge Amin. He's our go-to person and has been for months and months, and Mikiko. So I did thank you at the briefing this morning and reiterate it again now. It's my great pleasure to introduce His Excellency Jukka Salovara from the mission of Finland. And again, like I said with Daniela, when we went to the mission of Finland, it was just a wonderful open door and come in and see how can we engage together. And we're going to have a session together tomorrow. So you're most welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be here today and give opening remarks at this event on working together to end homelessness. And of course, homelessness is a serious and a very, very sad topic, but I would really like to begin on a positive note on the experience that I can share from Finland, and the story here is in a way that you can do something about homelessness. And since the mid-1980s, homelessness has been very much in focus of government programs in Finland. And actually, during the recent years, well, Finland has been the only country in Europe where actually homelessness has decreased. And there is a solid policy behind it. And we actually have a goal to halve homelessness during the term of this government, and eradicate homelessness altogether within 2 government terms, which means by 2027. So this is quite soon. And of course, many have asked that what lies behind sort of these numbers? Why sort of have we been able to sort of decrease homelessness significantly? Why can we sort of even look at the near future where we will aim to have sort of, well, zero homelessness? And I think that one cornerstone is our policy of that's called housing first, the housing first principle. And this has been really the basis for our strategy for dealing with homelessness since 2008. And this housing first principle is based on a very simple idea, and that's the fact that we need to give people permanent housing and the support they need as soon as they become homeless. And because when a person has a roof securely over their head, it is easier for them to focus on solving their other problems. And perhaps sort of traditionally, housing has been seen as one of the sort of final goals of social recovery and the social recovery process. But this is about sort of, well, starting with sort of housing and providing a roof. And this paradigm shift really puts housing at the top of the list. And this is a first step when we want to help homeless people to, well, get back on their feet. And in practice, this means that, well, hostels have been converted into supported housing units with independent flats for the tenants. And there are several new ways to support people and to improve integration in the neighborhood, and these have been developed. And in recent years, the state has launched and funded programs aimed at reducing homelessness, which have tackled the situation of the most vulnerable long-term homeless. And with the help of these programs, municipalities and organizations have provided new housing and reformed their services. On the path to end homelessness, we really need to understand better what are the factors behind leading to homelessness and what lies behind them. And we will actually develop the collection of statistics on homelessness, and this is very much about having an evidence-based policy in dealing with the homeless. And it's also important to note that ending homelessness with this housing first policy is both ethically right, but it is also economically sustainable. It makes economic sense. Overall, the goal of the Finnish government is to build a socially, economically, and ecologically sustainable society. And we will, for example, implement a set of measures to decrease the carbon footprint of housing, improve the energy efficiency of the existing building stock, and support the transition to emissions-free heat generation. And this is all about sort of also at the same time reducing the carbon footprint of housing. And this is that we really want to fight climate change sort of in all its dimensions in a fair way from the social and regional perspective. Finally, I would just like to say that, well, governments are really responsible to secure affordable housing for all. Markets alone, and especially without regulation, will not be able to deliver on this point. And addressing the housing needs of the poorest and most vulnerable must be a strong priority. Promoting sound housing policies is also crucial for fighting climate change, increasing resilience, mobility, and decreasing energy consumption. The roads for implementing this commitment can look different. Each government must determine how to provide better outcomes as they do now, but the positive fact is that homelessness can be solved with a comprehensive social policy. Thank you.
Ambassador, I think that's the dream for all of us, that we could hear our own individual country say that homelessness has decreased in our country. That is our dream. And not just housing, as His Excellency has said, but it's housing with support, because it's the most vulnerable people that remain homeless if we don't have the support that's needed. So you've given us a dream scenario, and let's hope many of the governments around the world would follow Finland. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dame Louise Cleary, whom I first met when we were in Nairobi in preparation for this commission. And I was enthused by her enthusiasm in terms of this subject. Dame Louise is chair of the Institute of Global Homelessness and has been involved for over 20 years. She has been instrumental in the development of a number of social policy programmes for the UK government. And again, I think you have made great strides, as we've heard this morning. There are good models in the UK, so that's really good news for us. Throughout your career, Dame Louise has maintained her commitment to the charity sector and has been a driving force in the establishment of the Institute of Global Homelessness. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Mark and Dame Louise, and Father Memo, who's a member of the Working Group to End Homelessness, who has been guiding us along this journey. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Dame Louise.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up, if that's okay, everyone. It's just easier if I'm slightly nervous to be on my feet. First of all, Sister Jean, you are amazing, and alongside Memo, you have created quite a lot of magic, and you tirelessly and relentlessly have worked on this issue on behalf of homeless people and all of the organisations. So it's lovely of you to thank everyone else, but ladies and gentlemen, we should mark this too. So I wanted to say a couple of things, really, and I'm very grateful, Daniela, to both yourself, Makiko, yourself, Amin, and everyone, actually, in the Commission for Social Development and UNDESA. I walked in this morning as the fog was still over the other side of the river and the top of the buildings, and I looked up and I thought, dear God alive, I'm actually in the United Nations. And I'm actually here to talk about something that we have been talking about, I know I look terribly young, 35 years. And here we are, folks. We've got a whole commission. And we may not know what the answer is to all of this, but we've got a bloody good idea, frankly, to use good old English language. And yes, we're still European, just in case anybody's, just in case. We're not chucked out of everything yet, but it won't be long. Anyway, no, I am just so privileged to be here. I was privileged to be in Nairobi, and I think that what you're all doing, what we're all doing here, is just so important in terms of seriously not leaving anyone behind. This is an expression which now we use in my own country all the time. It's an expression that's used here at the UN. It's an expression that's used around Sustainable Development Goals. It's an expression used actually in the European Union. And there is just a danger, and it's a significant danger, that we will leave homeless people behind, and we will leave children growing up in endless forms of temporary accommodation, which sounds so innocuous, doesn't it, temporary accommodation, until you realise it's 30 families sharing one toilet and 1 bathroom, and that's in the United Kingdom. That is not in the global south, that's in the global north. So I suppose our starting point, and a tribute here to Mark McGreevy, who will speak for himself later, but he has made me take this issue so incredibly seriously and made me understand it to a much greater depth. So what I want to show you now is what we've got. Thank you, Amin. Emergency slides when I knew I was doing this afternoon. So this is the Institute of Global Homelessness came together about 5 years ago with some people that are in the room and some people that have been with us this week, like Dennis Culhane and Suzanne Fitzpatrick and various other leading researchers. And what we tried to do here, and it stood the test of time, is create a broad definition of the typologies, to use the lingo of researchers. I'm not great at that, but basically this lists out the various forms that homelessness manifests itself. And as you can see, it covers just about all the different forms and manifestations of homelessness throughout the globe. So it means that we do have something that we can talk about that is specific enough to make sure that the people that do this well can say they do it well, and can make sure that the people, i.e. states, that do not do it well enough know that we are talking about them and that we can see them. The point about a definition is it's about visibility. Making people count isn't just a numerical thing. It's not an enumeration. It is a value upon which we judge each other about how we see each other. And homeless people and their children are often unseen. So counting and definitions is a lot more than a number, and it's a lot more than a statistical chart. It's a recognition of the people who are not seen and we will leave behind. So that's our starting point, and that's why we came this week, and we come each time and we work with as many people as we can to say, actually, no, it's not okay for every different country to talk about something differently, because then I can't shine the light on the people that do well and shine the light on the people that criminalise homelessness, for example. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I wanted to show is the next slide. Thanks very much. Obviously, they don't trust me with that thing because it would be chaos. And so, again, this is kind of scratch research. I'm not going to pretend that this is at the pinnacle of it. So what we did is we tried to look country by country and continent by continent about what data is collected. And as you see on there, you've got wide spaces that are white, where nothing is collected formally and properly. You've got other places that collect lots of things but mix them all up, mixing up displaced people and refugees with people that are street homeless. They just throw it all in. You've got other places that do have a lot of administrative data, places like the United Kingdom, that then choose to ignore that data. So it gives you I can talk about my own country. If any of you talk about it, there'll be trouble, but I can slag myself off. It's okay. I was the homelessness czar. So that tells you that basically the paucity of data, in all seriousness, is just not good enough. And then the third thing I wanted to show you, thank you, is this. Okay, so Joanna, who I think is known to many of you in the room, he's part of ending the working group to end homelessness. So we thought, I tell you what, we'll be clever, right? We're a lobbying cause. We care a lot about homelessness. So what we did is we all know we walk around with these sustainable development goals. And yes, Richard Curtis, great man, emailed me this morning. Wow, how are you getting on, kid? Lovely. He's older than me, thank God. And so what we did is Joanna looked at the 17, and we did that classic thing that you normally do in lobbying, which is you say, I tell you what, if you're going to meet your sustainable goal, then you need to look at our cause. And we'll come in under that. So, ending homelessness is key to ending poverty. Yeah, well, they're not measuring homelessness when they're measuring poverty, they're measuring poverty. You look at number 11, which of course is the one that we pretty much fit under, and you look at that and you think, well, what they're measuring at the moment for that sustainable development goal will not at the moment get to vast numbers of people who are homeless. That's the bottom line. And that's what we talked about with UN Habitat and others last year, that there's something missing here which we need to get at. And so, for example, if you've got people who are basically rickshaw people on the streets, people in lots of forms going around collecting the trash in order to make some money, people that are on the streets, people in the United Kingdom that don't have an address, people who you can't enumerate in a census because so far the census doesn't get to people who won't give you their address. So you miss out people. So our argument was, and remains, yes, of course, we're right behind the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're really worried that if the people who are homeless are not visible and are not seen, if we can't describe them, and then we can't count them, and if we can't count them, then governments ignore them. I've worked for 4 prime ministers. I know how politics works in the United Kingdom. I got a pretty good guess about how it works elsewhere. If you don't count it, it's not a target. If it's not a target, it's not going to have any money spent on it. If it's not going to have any money spent on it, you're going to find it pretty hard to solve. So there's a real science behind this that's really important to grip and not to ignore. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, which is my final slide, is Finland are at the moment leading on this, and I am so pleased that somebody is in the European Union, and I'm grateful to you for that. My own country had almost 10,000 people sleeping rough over the course of a year 20 years ago. And over a 3-year period, we had that down to the hundreds. And the United Kingdom has a population of about 60, 70 million people. And in that population, we had a street homelessness problem that we reduced. We went on to make sure that kids didn't grow up in bed and breakfast hotels, and we pretty much eradicated that as well. Unfortunately, that stayed that way for a decade, and then because of politics and various other things, but definitely politics, in a decade, the numbers have reversed in the wrong direction. So we went from being a world leader to being a world failure. No nice way to describe it, but that's the truth. And how we did it, and I think this is just so important. I went for the homelessness czar's job, and I was really nervous, and I didn't really know how to describe what I thought we needed to do. So I said to them, look, the thing about this homelessness thing is it's like a bathtub. And it's an overflowing bathtub. And when you've got an overflowing bathtub, the first thing you do when you run into the bathroom, if you have one, is you actually switch the taps off. The first thing you do is you switch the taps off. The second thing you do is you stick your arms in and you unplug it, and you cause a bit more displacement of water whilst you're unplugging things, because that's not a straightforward process. And then you have to clean the place up pretty thoroughly and make sure that it doesn't happen again. That's how you solve homelessness. And it's solving it, not tackling it. So a lot of people, I think, when they want to work together to end homelessness, think that means I need my organisation to get more money so I can build more shelters. Or I need my organisation to get more money so I can open up more shops that homeless people can work in. Give me more money and I'll build more affordable housing. All of those things help, but they don't solve it. We knew in London which prison in North London discharged on a Friday afternoon, thereby sending people down to King's Cross to basically get their drugs with the £46 grant that they were discharged from prison with. We all like to pretend we work 24 hours a day in homelessness. Just dream on, folks. Monday morning, Wandsworth in South London discharged their prisoners then, giving us a fighting chance of routing them straight into a day centre nearby. So yes, you can have research solutions to homelessness, and I want them. You can also know where people were before they were discharged from prison or hospital. Some things are much tougher to switch the taps off. If kids have had institutional experiences in care in my country, they're significantly more likely to end up homeless. It took us 5 years to get a decent package in place for kids when they left children's homes. So some of it's straightforward and some of it is not. But do you know how we know the answer to those questions? Because we talk about data and information and we follow people. In terms of people in the middle, in that bathtub, right now in the United Kingdom, in London, there are 5,000, in the country there are 5,000 people who sleep on the streets. 2,000 of those people, I can tell you this because of data, 2,000 of those people have been out on the streets for more than 2 years. This is a rich, developed country. 2,000 out to... Right. Next up, I'm coming to the end, I promise. Next up, I can tell you that those... So I was just doing next up to myself then. Just it's the after-dinner slot, so, you know, you've got to rock it. We're at the after-lunch slot. I tell you, it's a killer, this one. So I can tell you out of those 2,000, 88% have significant drug, alcohol, and mental health problems. So now I can tell you that if you think handing out soup is the solution to that, or indeed shelter is the solution to that, you're wrong. It's going to take something much more complicated. I'll take those, incidentally. I'm not saying don't take those, but I'm saying you have to understand what's in your bathtub in order to solve it. And then when it comes to the draining away, which I think we didn't do brilliantly on first time round, but if we had another go, we would, we basically helped people stay off the streets by actually getting them on great benefits and great social welfare and great housing benefit. We didn't do a good enough job around getting them into work and getting them into employment and training. And that's where I would head if I had my time over again. And as much as I want people and hear the voice of people with lived experience, I don't want people to feel that they have to have the label homeless for the rest of their lives. People have to have the dignity of being equal to all of us in this room, whether we've had an experience of homelessness or whether we have not. The United Nations is about equality. The United Nations is that it unites us. It unites each nation of the globe. So I feel, Daniela, so grateful to you and to the UN DESA. She's not here. She's gone. But I'll speak anyway. I am so grateful to them because this has put something on the map that just wasn't. It's given a voice to the people without voice. It's given sight to the people who were not in sight. But the battle, folks, is just beginning. It is not ending. So I'm obsessed with making sure we know who is homeless. Frankly, if the UN and the Stats Commission and all of those people don't play ball with the collection of this data, I think we should do it anyway. We should find somebody to help us do it anyway. We should track homelessness throughout the globe, and we should have them up in the headlights so that they are not left behind. And I don't want to get to 2020 with lots of people having lots of meetings saying what a great job we've done, if there are children dying on the streets, and there are kids in the United Kingdom who live their entire childhood in temporary accommodation. We will have failed. And as Finland has shown, and as God love us in the United Kingdom, sometimes we do some good things, and God knows we do some bad things. But it is possible to solve this problem, not just to think we have to always run services. So, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you very much for listening.
Dame Louise, we are very glad you're still European, however that is coloured. I think
I
one...
have an Irish passport.
Well,
okay.
Perfect. I wish you luck with that one.
Yeah, I know.
I think one of the things that struck me as you were speaking is that homelessness is not a permanent condition for someone. It's something that happens along the journey. And I think what we're trying to say, Louise, is that there are things that can happen along the way that can support that if we have the right systems and structures to do that. I think both Mark and Louise are saying the same things. How can we solve a problem if we don't agree on what the problem is and how it breaks down? And I think the second thing you both have said is that the gap is in a global measurement. How can we solve the problem without knowing the size? I think that's really, really important. And I think that's what all of us in terms of the working group to end homelessness and many others are looking for. So thank you very much for bringing that out again, Dame Louise. So we're going to start talking about what we've got gathered here for, working together to end homelessness. I'm part of and one of the founding members of the Working Group to End Homelessness, which was established 2 years ago. As a group, we committed to making this issue of homelessness the common focus of our advocacy work at the United Nations, almost for 2 years. and we've worked with our grassroots people as well. We started off with 6 NGOs, and we're now 40. It's quite a phenomenal group, and many of them are here today, and I'm very proud to be part of that group. This afternoon session has a good theme for us to reflect on together. It's a panel where we will not only discuss the issue at hand, but also a meaningful dialogue and celebration of the successes of individuals, states and non-state actors. How do we work together to end homelessness? Though valuable, it's not enough to focus on successful individual programs. Rather, we must extend the conversation to systemic approaches that address the underlying causes. And I know personally from my experience in Ireland, India, the Philippines, Peru, and many other countries, that housing solutions combined with the right supports can end homelessness. And we have some people who'll be sharing their own success stories, if I should say success, but that's the truth. One of the interesting things about this afternoon's panel is that we have people from diverse backgrounds and experiences, sharing both the human and lived experience, organisational approaches, and policy and political interventions. I predict that their contribution will reveal opportunities for cross-sectoral action, initiatives and cooperation, and will show the necessity for the human rights lens in our strategising together. As we know, funders can play a powerful role in convening diverse stakeholders, facilitating system-wide collaboration, and identifying key gaps in homeless systems. For this reason, we must make sure that the furthest left behind are intentionally included, represented, considered with concern, and this process is seen as less radical into the future. Only then can the fruits of our collaborations be the harvest we need, and indeed what we've set out to have yielded with the 2030 agenda. And I was just thinking there when somebody talked about ending homelessness, and I think it was yourself, Ambassador, by 2027. If we could all say that by 2030, when the end of the Sustainable Development Goals will come to an end, what a success story we will have. There's power in organisations / systems speaking with one voice, but we want that voice to be just. So how do we coordinate ourselves through our organisations, our programmes? How can we learn, share and collaborate with a just multi-stakeholder approach at the national and international level? There is no one solution to ending homelessness. We are here this week on the business of preventing and ending homelessness. Governments, local states, private funders, non-profits, service providers, community leaders, activists, experts, both academic and experiential. And for all of us, this success is about ending homelessness so that everyone has access to a safe, secure and affordable place called home. While passionate and knowledgeable in each of our respective areas, none of us can solve homelessness alone. We need to work together to close the gaps and provide a platform for shared knowledge to find what solutions work best for individuals / families experiencing homelessness. Most importantly for me, and I've been working in this area for almost 30 years, there is no solution without the people who have that expertise on the journey of homelessness. So they have to be part of the solution. And that is my passionate dream. And I'm delighted here today we have those voices. And that's where I'm longing to get to this afternoon. So let's open and let's have a great conversation. The first speaker is Miss Francesca De Ferrari, who's the Programme Management Officer at UN Habitat New York office. I'm so delighted to be part of that NGO group. And again, I want to compliment Chris Williams, who's been one of our great supporters here in New York in looking at this issue of homelessness. You've been working in the fields of sustainable development and humanitarian action for 2 decades. You have worked with UNICEF as Chief of Water and Sanitation Department in El Salvador. In the last 10 years in the UN Habitat New York office, you've covered a number of different roles, working on many different interagency and intergovernmental processes. You are very dedicated in building partnerships and ensure coordination among UN agencies. And we're all going to be part of this journey with you into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. First of all, I would like to thank also Deza and in particular Amin, Makiko and Daniela, with whom we have a long-standing cooperation and is growing stronger and stronger. And of course, our partner with whom we couldn't, achieve anything. And UN Habitat is always looking for stronger partnership, and we really hope that by the end of today we will even trigger some new partnership along the audience. Ensuring access to adequate housing for all is at the heart of UN Habitat mandate. To this scope, UN Habitat promotes the housing at the center approach. Realizing SDG 11 and its target means understanding that the housing is not just a roof. Housing is the first and foremost a fundamental human right, the fulfillment of which requires a concerted, coordinated, and multidisciplinary effort from all stakeholders. The Sustainable Development Goals, through Target 11.1, provide access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing by 2030. And the new urban agenda have set an unprecedented recognition of how adequate housing can contribute to sustainable development and people's well-being. Within this framework, homelessness should be understood as a social failure rather than an individual one. Homelessness mainly corresponds to a state's failure to protect and fulfill fundamental rights. Therefore, when developing, formulating, and implementing our tools, policy, and programs, we should place people at the center of our thinking and action. In doing so, our special attention should be to the housing need of the poorest and the most vulnerable, those who live on the street in temporary shelter, and housing with inadequate conditions, including women, youth, older persons, migrants, or people with disability. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, with the collaboration of UN Habitat, organized the expert group meeting on affordable housing and social protection system for all to address homelessness, held in Nairobi the past May, in order to identify the unaddressed challenges and key areas of intervention for all stakeholders involved in promoting and protecting housing rights, tackling homelessness, and overall realizing the SDG 11. UN Habitat is in the process to finalize the report, and it will be soon available for all to see the finding of this excellent good meeting that our panelists were part of also. The lack of universally agreed definition of homelessness and the swept picture of both the drivers and the vulnerable groups affected by homelessness are only few of the many factors contributing to inadequate policy responses. The youth, the elderly, the women, the members of LGBT community, those living with disability, the migrants, and asylum seekers, and other vulnerable groups have been and will be the most vulnerable to this phenomenon and must be afforded special protection. National policy should also reflect the increasingly crucial role played by the private sector and other non-governmental actors in delivering affordable housing solutions. The increasing commodification of housing, for example, requires policymakers to regulate real estate markets and work together with private sector and civil society actors towards the creation of an inclusive housing policies with a view to finally put an end to homelessness. The financialization of housing is not necessarily and entirely an unjust process, a real estate development is also capable of generating affordable housing solutions for low-income people. Although this requires a shift to a human rights-based approach to housing, as well as cooperation between private and public sector. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to homelessness, and its root causes are heavily influenced by given social, economical, and political aspects. Successful policy action plans and strategies should therefore be multidisciplinary, cross-sectoral, and establish strong public-private cooperation. Overall, UN Habitat works to provide technical assistance to government to support policy reform, improve governance, and enhance capacity of stakeholders in addressing constraints in protecting housing rights. In the past 3 years, we were able to support more than 40 local and national government, and we are here to support as many as request our help. As we talk, the World Urban Forum is heading to the end. The World Urban Forum is the forums where a non-governmental organization, government, the private sector, they meet every 2 years to discuss all kinds of issues of housing. And I'm happy to report that yesterday there was a special session of homelessness. So I suggest you to wait for the outcome document and to see what rich discussion has been going on in Abu Dhabi. I would also like to invite you next Tuesday. We have a film festival here in headquarters in conference room 4. And what we will discuss is exactly affordable housing. And there is also one of the documentary by the special rapporteur to the SG on affordable housing. And I assure you that each one of them is really worth seeing and understanding the issue and the possible solution. I would like to end by commending also your efforts and commitment to the New York Urban Agenda and the SDGs, but most especially to lending your support to one of the life's most fundamental rights, the right to adequate housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Francesca. And I think what we heard is, again and again, housing is not just a roof. It's a fundamental human right. And we've been saying this, that, it's something that must happen. And I think, again, that this housing partnerships or the solutions will only happen in partnership. And how are we going to do that together? And no one size fits all. I think that was very clear, Francesca. So thank you very much indeed. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Mark McGreevy. For years, 2 years, at the Working Group to End Homelessness, we heard about this very famous man, Mark McGreevy, OBE. And it was just a privilege a year ago when I met you. Mark is the Chief Executive of DePaul International, and you have oversight of the entire group of DePaul charities around the world. And I know they're in Ireland as well and doing very well in terms of housing with support. Mark splits his time between DePaul and 2 partner projects, the FAMVIM Homeless Alliance and the Institute of Global Homelessness. And as I said at the beginning, Mark and Louise and IGH have been very supportive of us as a working group to end homelessness. I really want to talk, Mark, about your passion for breaking the cycle of homelessness. And in doing that, you always focus on the people. You are someone who challenges conventional thinking about homelessness around the world and always looking for creative ways to break the cycle. You're a man with passion and compassion, and I'm delighted you're here.
Thank you. I wish my mother was here to hear that. I want to use my 5 to 7 minutes to address 3 questions. So the first one is, why do we need a global movement to end homelessness? Secondly, how might we support that movement? Because all of you in here are advocates, researchers, practitioners, people who work within this sector. And then finally, what might be some of the long-term goals and frustrations in achieving this, okay? So I want to look at those three things. But the first thing I wanted to ask, which is a very important question, is how many bird watchers have we got in the room today? This slide that's up there. We've got some?
One back here.
One back here. We've got more than that, but people are embarrassed to admit this. The reason I asked this question is that 6 years ago, I was in my garden, and my next-door neighbour was out counting birds. He was counting birds in the garden, and I said, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "Well, every year in February, in the United Kingdom, the Royal Society for Protection of the Birds has something called the Great Backyard Bird Count. And you count all of the birds in your garden, and you count the species of birds in your garden. And then you collate it, and you've got a health of the bird population." I went online. I was fascinated by this. And when I went online, I found out that at exactly the same time, 100 countries around the world count the birds in their garden. And all of this information is fed into one international database. And from that, yes, you can get idea of national bird statistics. But for migrating birds, you can tell are numbers going up or are numbers going down. If they're going down, is this a man-made disaster? Is it a natural disaster that's caused the diminishing? But you can do something about it to get those numbers back up again. And it suddenly struck me, isn't it a strange world where we know more about the numbers of birds in the world than we know about homeless people? Isn't it a really strange world that we live in where we've got that? And as Louise has already said, and I'm going to build a little out of what Louise said, this absence of of definition and this absence of measurement is a really pressing problem. Ask yourself why in the SDGs, given the fact that homelessness is probably present in all of our towns and cities across the world, why isn't homelessness a specific measured goal for reduction? And the reason is, as Louise said, without a definition, without a measurement, it doesn't exist at all. So why do we need a movement for global homelessness? Because we need to make people visible. That's the first point that I want to make. What can we do to support it? Here's something I've worked out in life. People are basically good. They're not trying to stand in the way of things. They're basically good. But we don't communicate properly around what we can do to end homelessness. So building out of the bathtub, so to speak, that Louise talked about, we have to be thinking hard about how we, in our little local environments, are thinking how we encourage people to be more innovative in what they do. So how do we make people think more about good policy making, both here in the UN at the global level, but at a regional level? How do we encourage the homelessness sector to be more joined up? How do we encourage governments and the voluntary sector and civil society to be more joined up in what we do? How do we work collaboratively? How do we turn off the taps, as Louise said, of what's happening? In the bathtub analogy and the overflowing, the system that Louise talked about, how do we really start thinking about the use of data that's on the ground? How are we thinking about not just counting people, but naming the people who are out there on our streets, getting to know their stories, creating systems that they don't have to fit into, but systems that work for them as individuals? How do we start to create a sector that thinks that way? And then how do we deal with what Louise said is the overflow? How do we get rid of how do we tackle these stories of individuals are on the street by not having a fixed set of services, but moving services to fit with the needs and requirements of people who are out on the street? How do we think innovatively about this? We can all lobby in our own little ways. We can all think locally about what we do about that. And then finally, within this, what's the movement's long-term goal? Well, I hope it's actually about ending homelessness. I hope that nobody sat in this room think it's good enough if one person remains on the street. The aim of this is to end homelessness. And to do that, we have to bring people together and get a common sense of direction, which is what we're trying to do in this week. We need to learn and disseminate good practices from research in countries that are achieving a marked reduction. And Louise can take great credit for the 2/3 reduction in the UK, which I don't think has ever really been disseminated in the way that it should. Finland is a good example sat here of the fact that it can do. We need to be talking about these stories that are out there. But ultimately, the longer-term goal, isn't it, is about setting a target to do this. And I'd love to think, Jean, that by 2027 or whatever we'll achieve. I'd love to think that, right? But he's my kind of like check is. We have a guy who works for me as our chair at DePaul, Ukraine, called Vitaly Novak. And he tells me this great story under communism. He said when he was 8 or 9, when he was returning from his village, his school, to his home, if he ever saw a queue outside of a shop, he would join it, right? He didn't know what was the end of it, right? But he knew it would be something good if people were queuing, yeah? And that's exactly what we're doing. We've joined a queue. We've begun a debate today about ending homelessness. But here's what I'll set you as the longer-term target, and this is for every advocate in this room. When the SDGs are renegotiated in 2030, if we haven't achieved a goal for the ending of homelessness by then, to be part and present and monitored by the UN Statistical Commission, then we failed. Okay? So that's the deal. Thank you very much.
It's difficult to hear the analogy of the birds, Mark, and statistically what has been achieved, and yet when it comes to the human count, that doesn't happen. And I agree with Mark, we have to look at getting quantitative statistics in relation to homelessness, but I would also add we need qualitative as well, because if we do that, we'll also get the voices of the people, which is really important. I like to use the word about, you used the word movement. And in the last few days, I think I'm convinced of that we need to move from organisations to movement. And I think if we could begin to create that, I chatted to President Mary McAleese about it the other day. So we both got very excited about the possibility of doing that. And I think that change will be very different. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, Mark. Thank you. So the next on my list, I've just discovered who it is, it's Mr. Josh Littlejohn. So you're another name that I heard a lot about in the last year. So I'm delighted I said to Louise, is that who that is? And then she said, oh, his brother is here. Well, I've heard about different family members being here this week, including my own sister. So it's nice that we're bringing along our families to this.
And girlfriend.
Oh, and girlfriend. That's even better. There's a lot of boyfriends and girlfriends around, but I'm not going to name them either.
Well, I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Sister Jean, but I'm not sure we're going to let you get away with that later. Okay, session over, everyone.
Nice
one. You make me laugh. You really do.
This is what it was like in Nairobi. So, Josh, you are the world's social entrepreneur and campaigner, having led a global movement to tackle homelessness and displacement. Josh's work began you working with the homeless issue when you founded Social Bite, a social enterprise in Scotland with a mission to eradicate homelessness in the country. In May 2018, Josh and his team launched an innovative accommodation project for homeless people in Edinburgh called the Social Bite Village. And I wish it was there when I entered the Daughters of Wisdom X years ago, and that's where I began my journey. And you welcomed the first residents later that year. In May 2019, alongside Will Smith and Dame Helen Mirren, you launched a global campaign, The World's Biggest Sleep Out. And we were privileged to have that here in New York at Christmas. And Margaret and Kieran did the sleep out on behalf of the Working Group to End Homelessness. And I think Lucas is here as well, yes, and Joanna. So that was a real success for us here in New York. We're really looking forward to you telling us about this most interesting story and your entrepreneurial skills, and we're dying to learn from them as well. So you're most welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such an amazing honour and privilege to be here. I want to thank Amin for inviting me to join this, and particularly thank Dame Louise, who supported me all last year on the World's Big Sleep Out campaign. And as I'm sure you've seen from her speech, she's a complete powerhouse, and we would have never achieved a fraction of what we did without your support, and also Mark's been a massive support to me as well. And I'll come to Indu later, who staged sleep outs in 25 Indian cities, which was pretty good. So yeah, I'll just kind of spend the 5 to 7 minutes just briefly outlining my kind of journey, and I'll try and highlight the sense of collaboration in people from all walks of life, whether it's politics or school children or business leaders coming together on this issue, and the power that I've seen that have in Scotland and further afield. So it all kind of started for me in this issue almost 8 years ago now. I co-founded this little cafe you can see on the screen called Social Bite, and we opened it in the city centre of Edinburgh in 2012. And originally the idea, to be honest, didn't actually have anything to do with the homelessness issue, but we just opened this cafe and we were in there making coffees and serving customers, and we ended up meeting this young guy who was 19 years old. He was homeless. He was selling the Big Issue magazine on the street corner just outside the front door of that cafe there. And after about 2 weeks, this young man, his name was Pete, he came into the store and he sort of plucked up the courage this day and he asked us if he could have a job. And we kind of thought, why not? It seemed a nice thing to do, so we gave him a job in our kitchen. And he worked really hard, and we saw the job was quite transformative for him, so we thought, let's try it again. And we asked him if he knew anybody else that was homeless that might want a job. And he suggested his brother, Joe, who was also homeless, also selling the Big Issue. So we said, okay, we gave Joe a job. Joe worked hard, and another job became available. And we said, guys, do you know anybody else? And they said, well, there's a guy down the road called John, might be quite good. So we said, okay. So we gave John a job. At this stage, I think it dawned on them all that we were kind of soft-touch employers, and they could probably get some jobs for some of their other friends. And they said, maybe you should give this other guy Colin a try. So we said, okay. So almost by accident, really, we started to get involved in this issue by offering jobs in this little cafe. And as we got a bit more engaged in it, we decided to introduce this pay-it-forward system, where as customers were coming in, we started to ask them, maybe you might like to buy an extra coffee or an extra sandwich for someone who's homeless to get something for free later. And customers started to do that, and we started to feed 30 or 40 people every day in this little cafe from donations that people had paid in advance. So that was how it all got started about 8 years ago. And you know, we managed to expand the shops. We thought, let's give Starbucks a run for their money, and we opened 5 little cafes in 3 cities in Scotland. But out with the immediate locality of the shops, almost nobody would have ever heard of us. But that sort of changed a bit in 2015, when it sounds a bit bizarre and crazy, but somewhat spectively we decided to write a letter to George Clooney, and we wrote him a letter, and we invited him to come to Scotland and invited him to come and visit our little cafe. And amazingly, if you go to the next slide, in November 2015, he did. So suddenly, our little cafe was on the front page of every national newspaper in the United Kingdom. I had cousins that live in South Africa phoning me up saying, we've just seen you on Sky News with George Clooney. And everyone was going, what sandwich did he eat? But suddenly it gave us a great platform to try and build on. And we wanted to develop some more ambitious campaigning, some more ambitious fundraising, and so ultimately some more ambitious programs around the issue. So to do that, we started to stage these fundraising sleep out events. So we staged our first sleep out in 2016, and we had 270 people sleep out in a little square in Edinburgh called Charlotte Square. And then we started to expand that year on year, so we decided to make it a mass participation event the next year, and we ended up with 8,000 people, and they collectively managed to raise £4 million. And then we grew it to 4 Scottish cities. And then last year, for some bizarre reason, I kind of came up with the idea to try on a one-off basis stage a big international campaign around the sleep out model. So I very fortuitously met Louise and Mark and people that helped along the way. And we had an aspiration to get a really iconic venue here in New York and an iconic venue in London to be the flagships sleep outs, and then we wanted to try and ultimately work with 50 cities all over the world. And through a series of small miracles and great support from so many people, we ended up managing to close down Times Square here in New York, if you go to the next slide, Trafalgar Square in London, and 52 cities all over the world took part, including 25 in India, led by Indu. And we had an estimated 60,000 people, and this is people that were business leaders, the chief executive of the NASDAQ stock exchange, but it was also school children and university students, and people with lived experience of homelessness, and people from all walks of life coming together to take a stand and raise some money. And we ended up raising in the region of $10 million through that campaign. So I've personally seen the power of that sense of collaboration. And what we've been able to devote that money towards in Scotland is a couple of projects that we're really proud of, and we're interested in trying to expand those. So one, inspired by Finland, was a big Housing First programme. We managed to secure pledges to 830 mainstream one-bedroom flats in Scotland, which we helped, along with the Scottish Government, fund a support system. And the other project, which was a bit more unusual and a bit more innovative, was a project called the Social Bite Village. So if you just go to the next slide, this was a project which launched in 2018 in Edinburgh, where we approached the local council and we asked them if they had any vacant council-owned land, and they had this plot of land that was sat there derelict, had been for many years, and we decided to basically build a little village. So we commissioned the manufacture of these 2-bedroom prefabricated beautiful little homes. There's 11 of those, which house in the region of 20 people, and there's a big community hub. So that's been up and running now for over 18 months. And it's a really, really successful intervention and a fantastic alternative to the B&Bs and the hostels and the status quo of how we tackle homelessness. So this is something we're keen to try and explore taking out with Scotland as well. So yeah, thanks very much for listening to my story, and yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Just before we finish, I left this till the end to say that by the age of 33, Josh has raised over 22 million for charity and homeless causes. He has received an MBE from the Queen, which he dedicated to the homeless and marginalised. We really honour you. Thank you. I also like the fact, Josh, you talked about Pete and his brother. You know, that's the humanity side of what we're hearing, and your passion and compassion. And I think we'll all be talking to you after this session. Thank you so much. It's now my very great privilege to introduce Miss Elizabeth Madden, known to me as Liz. I didn't invite her here, I have to say, this week, but I invited her here before, but the UN have invited her here today. Liz has a lived experience of homelessness. She's from Ireland. You will know by her accent when she talks. She's a mother of one from Cork City, Ireland, who works in the frontline domestic violence services. She holds an honours degree in social science and a master's degree in women's studies from University College Cork in Ireland. Upon graduation, Liz was approached to lecture on the Diploma of Women's Studies programme, which she did for a number of years. Prior to returning to education and becoming employed, Liz experienced periods of homelessness, addiction, and other issues in relation to her out-of-home experience. She believes in the power of shared lived experiences and believes that we can only gain true insight through listening and learning from the lived experience. It is my greatest pleasure to be here this afternoon and welcoming you, Liz. You have just been a great inspiration to me and my life, and always we can do it, Jean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thanks. So my name is Liz Madden, and I'm a resident of Sophia Housing. It's an Irish housing organisation. 16 years ago, they saved me from homelessness by giving me not just a home, but supported long-term housing. And I needed the supportive aspect because I had experienced a lot of trauma in my life, and it's good that we've been hearing about the solutions to homelessness. It's not just about giving someone a home, because I believe I would have been probably homeless multiple times if I didn't get the support that went along with this. As I mentioned the word trauma, I actually thought I should focus my presentation on trauma from an experiential perspective. I guess we hear from the academic and policy policy developers, but I thought it might be interesting from people to hear an experiential perspective on trauma. So slide one, yeah, thanks. So I guess, as I said, I've been 16 years now out of homelessness, and I've had a lot of time to think about my experiences. And I looked at my trauma kind of in two different stages. One, when I was actually in the experience of trauma. I guess, firstly, looking at the drivers of trauma, and in my case, it was caused by neglect, abandonment, not having emotionally and physically present parents, having an abusive father also, impacts of trauma. So this translated into me experiencing mental health issues, addiction, and also going into unhealthy relationships and developing a very unhealthy sense of self, I suppose, and having low self-esteem and low self-confidence. As well, I guess, in the trauma, I was completely unaware, obviously, of the trauma. So, like a lot of people, when they experience trauma, they actually go into like multiple traumas because it's kind of like your comfort zone. It's your familiar. So for me, I found myself in a lot of traumatic experiences. And I think like trauma is something we can all relate to as human beings. I believe everybody in this room has experienced some extent of trauma, and I would hope that we would use this shared experience to connect to people, especially when we're talking about understanding homelessness. Well, luckily, you can actually come out of the trauma as well, and thankfully, well, I believe it's going to be like a lifelong process, and I've accepted that. But when I was coming out of my trauma, the first was like the realization that I actually had been traumatized, and that was a big step to actually acknowledge you've had this experience in your life. And I remember a therapist saying to me, like, Liz, like, do you realize the trauma that you've been through? And I was just like, no, not really. So it's kind of like, you know, it's a slow thing to kind of develop. Then after the realization is the recall. And as I said earlier, it's been 16 years since I've experienced homelessness. It's really only actually since October that I've fully recalled experiences of homelessness that I had blotted out of my mind completely. And I guess it's another process of trauma that you just put things aside. And what I realized that was when I was given an opportunity to speak in October, it was simply the people that offered me the space and who acknowledged my lived experience. It actually unlocked, it was the power of the acknowledgement that actually unlocked all these experiences that I had kind of pushed away. So I guess in terms of recovering from trauma, giving people a non-judgmental space and just listening and acknowledging their experiences can help a person to heal so much. The final stage of coming out of a traumatic experience is the recovery. A lot of it. And so for me, I've been to therapy for a number of years, and for me, recovery involved learning how to take care of myself, not just psychologically, but also physically. When you have low self-esteem, low confidence, you just don't care about yourself really. You don't know how to care for yourself. So like learning how to care for myself was from scratch, and it was in a very, very extremely difficult and long process. And I had to learn from years and years of neglecting myself how to care for myself. And that was like breaking a lifetime cycle, but it's possible. So I guess you can't, well, for me it's important to address the support systems coming out of my trauma, and first to put myself at the top of that and to say that I had to take personal responsibility to recover from my traumas, and to realise that I'm a part, if I want to recover now, I'm a big part of that. And I needed to, and of course we should encourage people to take responsibility, but to whatever limit and capacity that they have, because we're all coming from different capacities. We all have our limitations. I understand that homelessness can be very difficult for families. The first time I became homeless, it was because my mother took a barring order out against me because of my addiction and where I was. So I guess if you're a family member of a homeless person, the best thing that you can do is not to judge or criticise, and get yourself supported as well. Because I do think my mother, getting herself supported actually helped me in some way as well. In terms of community support, I think communities can and should be making efforts to deal with homelessness and homeless people. And this can be achieved simply by treating homeless people with respect and dignity, and knowing that when you're respected, it actually helps the healing process. And finally, for governments and NGOs, the only way you're going to get closer to solving a housing crisis or homeless crisis is by putting the people themselves in the discussion, which you obviously are doing. Second and third person's perspective isn't really good enough. Homeless people need to have other people to relate to. And I think it must be acknowledged that by being here today is a great example of how the UN, the Institute of Global Homelessness, UNANIMA, and my housing agency, Sophia Housing, have put us here to ensure that our voices are heard. And finally, it's so important, and this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, is just talk to people about the life after homelessness and the life after traumas, because there is, it's just a temporary state. It can just be a temporary state, and you can have an amazing life. So for me, I've accepted and happy to accept that my personal recovery will be a lifelong process. This means for me, at times when I feel myself slipping, I'll need to get myself to a therapist. I'll need to look after myself, my mental well-being. Employment and education was massive. I think somebody mentioned it earlier. It was not just about, it was Louise actually who said it when you were saying about that you got people the social welfare and the housing, but it has to be more than that, So for me, returning to education empowered me. It gave me the verbal articulation that as a teenager I was so frustrated because I didn't have the words to articulate my experiences, my abuse, my neglect, everything, and I had no expression for it. So then that obviously translated into anger and other things. So education and economic empowerment for me as a woman, as a mother as well, and having access to experiences. It's all within the recovery process, As well, meaning and purpose is something very important for me in a recovery. So for me, meaning and purpose is varied. It could be faith, it could be physical exercise, it could be taking a class, but it's doing something for myself. And also a big part of my recovery process was what I call returning home, and this is where I return back to the human being who I really believe that I was meant to be. And looking to the future, I will continue to break cycles. I really believe that I'm duty bound to do so, and I really want to continue to spread a message of hope, and I will continue to learn and grow. So thank you so much for listening.
And that's what I mean by the voice. That is what we're talking about. And you said you are now 16 years out of homelessness, but there's still a point where you're returning home. And all of us do that at some stage. All of us needing to return home within ourselves. So you've given us, there's no words to express what you express, Liz, but we need to hear that story, and you are part of the solution, and what you're doing in Ireland is quite unique. So I'm just very grateful that you've been here. Thank you. Tracy Parizo now, who is the Programme Officer leading Helmsley New York City Programme. In this role, she shapes and implements high-impact strategies focused on improving the lives and health of New Yorkers with the highest needs. Currently, the programme is investing in innovations to help unlock a more efficient, streamlined and responsive system of healthcare for New Yorkers with multiple chronic conditions, many of whom are also homeless. Tracy currently serves on the steering committee of the Fund to End Family and Youth Homelessness, and has previously served as chair of the Services Committee for the Coalition for New York City Domestic Violence Residential Providers, and co-chair of the Administration for Children's Services here in New York. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm struck by the words that we just heard from Elizabeth, and so thank you for that. And by so many things I've been hearing already today, I just feel like I need to say thank you for all of you that organized this event and this movement, which is already a movement, feels like a movement to me, and for reminding us that counting and queuing, those are really interesting, I really love those analogies, are so important. So thank you for that. I think of this as a big chance to zoom out. And when I say that, I did spend the first part of my career in domestic violence shelters as a social worker, and had lots of experiences where I felt very frustrated by the, I kind of call it, you're sandwiched in. It's really important to get out. And so I really appreciate this global perspective and how much it enables people to zoom out. Anytime you have the chance to get people to these big convenings, to get into the queue, please take it. It's really, really powerful, and we just heard a lot about that. So thank you. And I'd just like to share a quick example of how philanthropy can play a role in ending homelessness. And I'm fairly new to philanthropy, it's a couple of years in now, but it does have a powerful place, even though it is actually a small player in terms of funds that it requires to end something as big as homelessness. So what I want to spend a little time telling you about is a public-private partnership that it's a model I think is really encouraging, and I just wanted to share a little bit about one of the collaboratives that we're supporting at the Helmsley Charitable Trust to do this. 90% of Helmsley's grant making is focused on health, and I run the New York City program at Helmsley, which is much smaller than some of our other disease-focused areas, but is focused on improving the health. Thank you for the interventions that stabilize the New Yorkers with the highest needs. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about a Wall Street Journal article. I think you can actually move to the next slide. That recently profiled one of our grantees, our homeless healthcare grantees. He worked with someone named Nathaniel, and Nathaniel is a 57-year-old man who's been living in and out of homelessness since he was 18. He has seen dozens of doctors all over the city of New York, in emergency rooms, many different emergency rooms, clinics, and mostly for his chronic asthma and diabetes, but also for a foot injury, which is not so uncommon as most of us know, that has just never healed properly, and also he struggles with mental illness. So one thing that we know is that people like Nathaniel are using public institutions much more frequently than people who aren't experiencing homelessness. And one point about Nathaniel's health care is that he has not seen providers who have connected their data, and he has a hard time connecting his own data from one to the next. So this disconnected system of care is one of the things that has been failing people like Nathaniel. He tells us, and he tells his doctor, how his failing health is what brought him into homelessness, and homelessness is what's keeping him from stabilizing his health. It is a vicious cycle, and it's just a good example of how this goes, certainly not just in New York. As we sit here today in New York, a city with a population of more than 8 million, we can estimate that about 1 in every 100 New Yorkers is experiencing homelessness tonight. By recent counts, and this is both a street count and a shelter count, there are approximately 80,000 people sleeping in shelters around the street every night. When we look at those who are homeless, we know that health is a big part of the equation. And we heard from Nathaniel's story that experiencing extreme health conditions can be both a major driver and an underlying cause of homelessness. So it's our strategic focus at Helmsley to look through a health lens to try to impact our patient population. And we know we can do that when we look at the homeless population in New York City. We happen to have a right to shelter in New York, which requires that government try to place anyone seeking shelter in a bed. So we know that there's a place to find some of the homeless patients to do something to intervene. And philanthropy has the unique opportunity and obligation to fund in areas that others can't. The smaller, more flexible money that philanthropy has can forge coalitions with nonprofit organizations and government that can mobilize more government dollars than any single philanthropy could ever do on its own. So one of the opportunities we took is to convene a collaborative of homeless healthcare providers, a small number of very nimble and expert providers, to sit together with the medical director at the Department of Homeless Services in government on a collaborative. And that collaborative meets every month for 3 years, maybe more. And it's a space we've carved out for them to brainstorm together. And I really do think taking a step out in order to think and really pay attention and realize that you can kind of step out of that blame sandwich. It's a real, I like to call it a blame sandwich. Sometimes it's very hard for providers with all the pressures that exist to innovate. And so this is hopefully the space to do that. They've been working for about a year, and they decide on how to program some of the grant money that they have available to them. So far, 2 things to share. They're testing some innovations in bringing telemedicine to bring more specialist care into shelter environments, and they're also starting something that's a little less exciting to talk about, but to share data between providers. So actually, 2 of Nathaniel's physicians can now see what the other's done, so they don't repeat all the tests, wasting Nathaniel's time most critically, but also their own. So they're starting to forge ahead and test some of these impacts. And we're really excited. Government may be able to take some of these up if they work and scale them so that more people can avail themselves of them. So as we know, philanthropy is just one lever that can be useful to solve the problem of homelessness. But such a complex problem requires multifaceted response and commitments. And we're committed to doing our part, even through a health lens, and I'm so inspired that all of you have shared how you're working on it, and hopefully we can continue to work together. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Tracy. We are inspired by you as well. I think it's very hard to take that here in New York, 1 in 100 people are homeless. I mean, it's it's mind-blowing, isn't it? I think the other thing that's very creative that I heard you say is the convening of health personnel. So how do we creatively look together, collaborating to look at supporting somebody out of home? And we need that kind of collaboration from those professionals with a multidisciplinary approach to what we're doing. And I was interested in that sharing data with providers. I think was one of the last things I did when I was working in Ireland, where the housing worked on their own, the health worked on their own, the psychotherapist worked on their own. And they were all bits. And yet, how do we come together to service, the human being? So I'm delighted you were able to point that for us. Thank you very much indeed, Tracy. Louise, what are you hearing?
Right, okay. Didn't know it was that type of session, everyone. But, I'm hearing you've got some great gossip. But anyway, come on, you've all still remembered what she said. Thank you. What am I hearing? I mean, I think the thing that's so powerful is your voice, Liz. And I think that you reminded me of the fact that because people experience difficulties, homelessness isn't something we need to add on. So, we know that one of the biggest causes of homelessness is domestic violence. And what's really interesting about that is probably throughout the globe, no matter where we are, people say, yeah, it's a bad thing, but it creates homelessness for the person experiencing it and her children on the whole. And so I find these things really interesting, that when you started by saying, actually, yes, of course it's about a right to housing, but it's actually a right to a home. And home is a lot more than the bricks and mortar. And then kind of really that's about the people who are in the bricks and mortar and their lives. And I just think what's really interesting that Marissa, I think she was called from the OECD, actually reinforced what you were saying, Tracy, on Monday, when she said that there is a spike in people's use of healthcare services before they are homeless. And, the kind of, in all of this, if we just thought about the path of the person that was experiencing difficulties, and we all experience some difficulties of some kind in our lives because humanity is frail, it's how we deal with those difficulties. So why aren't we dealing with domestic violence being around domestic violence rather than homelessness? Why is, Liz, your background and what you experienced as a child and as an adult actually about homelessness when it should have been about trauma and supporting you out of that trauma? And the same way, Josh started out just basically saying, I'm going to run a shop and make some money, and ends up employing homeless people because somebody walked into your life and you thought, I want to do something a bit more than hand out a bit of money to him. And so I kind of, throughout all of this, what I've heard so far is if we see the people, we'll see the solution. If we hear from the people, we will hear the solution. And then, Mark blew me away a few years ago when he said, you're not going to, Louise, in one of his normally he says to me, get over yourself and get on with it. But anyway, on a nicer moment, he said something to me like, this bird thing is just insane. And yet the solution to some of the people stuff is right under our noses. It's right under our noses. It's not something we need to wait till 2030 to do or even 2027 to do. It's something we can do tomorrow. If we can count birds and we can count fish, we can bloody well see people. And so I think that's what really so far everybody has said is if we take the Copenhagen thing of 25 years ago and see the person, we might actually get a solution that is real as opposed to just do some stuff. So that's for me, that's what I've heard so far.
Thank you very much, Louise. That's a very interesting reflection on what we're hearing so far. I'm looking at my time, and I'm going to move to Amanda Andir, who has spent over 15 years working in the non-profit and public sector as a leader, committed to racial equity, social justice, and housing affordability through advocacy for systemic change. You are a member of the steering committee for the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. Previously, you served as an adjunct professor at George Mason University, teaching non-profit management. We're looking forward to your presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Funders Together to End Homelessness is a national network of over 250 members in the United States and Canada working to prevent and end homelessness both nationally and in their local communities. I want to bring into the room something that hasn't been brought up but is central to the root causes of homelessness, not just in the United States, but I think around the world. And it's part of the commitment that Funders Together made last year as we released our intentions and aspirations to racial justice and racial equity. We understand that structural and racial inequities are the root cause of homelessness, and that historical and persistent racial discrimination in housing, employment, healthcare, education, and the criminal legal system and other systems contribute to the high rates of homelessness for people of color. We also believe that in order to develop lasting solutions to homelessness, it is our collective responsibility to address its underlying causes, including racial inequity and government-sanctioned racism. Our work must center racial equity to strengthen existing strategies and create new approaches that more effectively recognize and meet the needs of people of color experiencing homelessness. This is just part of our commitment that we released last year. And I just want to spend a little bit of time going a little bit up from Tracy and talking about funders' role in not only collaborating together for systems change, but centering racial equity and racial justice in our work. As I mentioned yesterday in our remarks, too often funders enable communities that are program-rich and systems poor, because we're not focusing on what's happening community-wide. We're looking at individual outcomes. When we fund systems change, we look at the whole system. And when we look at the whole system, we're understanding what are the inequities that led us to homelessness. And as mentioned here before, going upstream to think about prevention. But what happens when we go upstream and realize that racial and other structural inequities from the criminal legal system, from the health system, from the child welfare system are contributing to such high rates of homelessness? What is the responsibility of funders to collaborate together, to get out of their own silos, and to help the public and private partnerships look at those upstream systems that are structurally racist, that are perpetuating disproportionately people of color to enter into homelessness? It is a mandate for philanthropy, but also for our public sector partners, to not put a Band-Aid on the problem by thinking about housing as the only solution. It is the main solution to end homelessness. But we should be thinking about housing justice and how we prevent homelessness from happening at all. And that is looking at our structural inequities that is perpetuating the types of homelessness that are pervasive and persistent in the United States, but I know across the country. The economic inequities, the class systems, the disregard for people of color living on the streets. This is a fundamental role in philanthropy, that we must pool and align our funding so we're not funding individual organizations, but a system that is responsive to the needs of people with lived expertise and is centering people with lived expertise not just on panel conversations, but we are turning over the rightful power that I don't know how we got to people with lived expertise in our grant-making decisions, participatory grant-making, and our policy-level decisions. In fact, we should not enter into a room and discuss ending homelessness if people with lived expertise are not at the table with a permanent chair and not a folding chair. This is the role of philanthropy, to fund the capacity of our systems and our programs to ensure that people with lived expertise are at the table, and that we are not expecting them to change the way that they show up. But in fact, we have to undo and unlearn all the things that contribute to a white dominant culture that doesn't allow them to participate in their full selves. The role of philanthropy in those flexible dollars is to give our nonprofits, our community organizations, our public partners, the freedom to learn about dismantling structural racist systems, white dominant culture systems that don't allow us to fully participate in getting to solutions because we're not centering people with lived expertise. We must understand that data is important, numbers are important, But when you're talking about structurally racist systems, data only tells part of the story. And so we must have an evaluation process that includes data, the voices of people with lived expertise, and evaluation that is qualitative combined with quantitative. Finally, I just want to say that it is really important that we understand that even the participation of philanthropy in this work is rooted deeply in capitalism that is deeply structurally racist. And so we have to unlearn our own behavior as philanthropists as we come in. We have to learn to give up power. We have to learn to share power. We have to learn to turn over resources and not dictate, as gatekeepers, how people use those resources. But that's not just for philanthropy. It's for providers. It's for NGOs. It's for our government. We have too much power and too much resources and agency over people's lives. And philanthropy can start to model how to change that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for a most interesting contribution to this afternoon's session. Your commitment to racial equity, social justice is most interesting. What I loved what you said was about housing justice. You know, that's a really important word to be using when we talk about homeless people. And then you talked about the voices, and we keep saying here, don't talk about us without us. But I think what's more important is when we're at our boards or organisational levels where it really matters to have a permanent chair at the table, not a folding chair. I will really remember that one. And of course, it's music to my ears when you talk about the voices of the people, that it's both quantitative and qualitative, because that is really important. And I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome Ashley Gromas, who was with us in Nairobi. Ashley is a doctoral research associate in the eviction lab at Princeton University. She joined the lab after completing her PhD in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2017. Her work in the lab focuses on estimating the prevalence of rental housing eviction in the USA, and the frequency of eviction changes over time and varies across communities. And I must say, when we were in Nairobi, if you remember, Louise, we were fascinated by this whole conversation on evictions, which I think is really underlying a lot of what we're talking about in homelessness. So I'm looking forward to hearing your session this afternoon, and it's lovely to see you again.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jean. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here today with you all to talk about the work that we've been doing in the eviction lab at Princeton University. We're an academic research lab. We collect data to try to study the prevalence, causes, and consequences of eviction in the U.S. Okay. I will just try to go without the slides for a little bit and see how that goes. Okay, so just definitionally, we study eviction, housing eviction, which is when a landlord removes a tenant from a rental property. This is only one of many types of forced moves that people may experience. So just to put in context, we look at one particular type of forced move, not sort of the landscape of forced moves in the US. And this is important because eviction has a lot of negative housing consequences. So it removes people from their housing, not just in the immediate aftermath of an eviction, but creates a lot of housing instability down the road as well. It can prevent tenants from accessing future housing as well. Once you have a record of an eviction in your housing history, you can be denied housing by landlords. You don't even have to be actually evicted for that to be the case. Even if you have a case filed against you or you go to court and win your case, that can still be held against you in your housing history. And of course, eviction has been linked to prolonged periods of homelessness as well. And so you may be wondering why we have an academic research lab to study eviction. It's because there's no official eviction statistics in the United States. They're not collected at the local level, not at the state level or the federal level. Previous research has shown that it's actually really hard to measure eviction in like national housing surveys because the population of people who are evicted don't tend to be well represented in these large surveys. The interesting thing about eviction is that it does leave a permanent record. It leaves a record in the courts. And so as these eviction cases take place across all of these local courts in the US, there are records that these have happened, but nobody has taken the initiative to sort of collect them together and say, you know, what do we have? What does eviction look like in the United States? And so what we did at Princeton was we set to work on creating the first national database of evictions in the United States. And I just put this map up here to show you that we sewed together court records from a number of different sources. This was a big effort. We ended up with data from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. We collected more than 80 million individual court records. If we couldn't get individual level records, we would ask for filing statistics, anything the courts could give us that would give us a handle on how many eviction cases were taking place. And so what we ended up estimating is the number of eviction cases filed nationally in the US each year. There was an increase up until about the year 2008, which is the height of the Great Recession. It's leveled off. The number of cases has leveled off over time. If you look at the rate, which is the red line, this is the number of cases filed against the number of renting households. There's actually been more of a curvilinear trend. That's probably because eviction does respond to financial pressures that were exerted on households during the Great Recession. It still stands to be said, though, that there's an average of 3.6 million eviction cases filed annually in the United States. At the height of the foreclosure crisis, there were 3.1 million foreclosure starts, which means that every year there's essentially a foreclosure crisis among renting households in the United States. We also mapped the data so people could see where eviction was most prevalent. One thing I want to highlight here is actually the places that we tend to talk about in debates on access to affordable housing, places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City. That is not where eviction cases are actually most prevalent. It's in the southeastern United States, which we almost never talk about when we're talking about stable access to affordable housing. And the reason why this is the case is that even when you take these states and you say, I'm going to try to set aside differences in eviction cases based on the households that would be most at risk for evictions, there's huge disparities in the number of cases filed, and this is likely because of landlord-tenant code in these states, which is the laws that govern how and when landlords file these cases. And in some states, particularly in the Southeast, landlords routinely file cases for collection of past due rent money. You can be 2 days late on your rent and your landlord can take you to court. And even if they don't ultimately evict you, this puts you in a very precarious housing situation, and this eviction records, the filing of the case stays on your record, which impacts your ability to rent in the future. Just as an example, so Maryland has the highest filing of any state, and in Baltimore, every year there are more eviction cases filed than there are renting households. That is how many cases are filed there. And so what we did with this data is we put it on a map. We made it public so that people could use it. And it ended up being cited in more than 100 national and over 300 local news stories. It was featured on the front page of the New York Times. It also contributed to increased attention to eviction in many states and cities across the U.S. So there's been since we've released the data, there's been new eviction laws and tenant protections in 5 states and at least 8 cities that we know about. I'm going to highlight Richmond, Virginia, because they started an eviction diversion program that was a direct response to the release of our data because they are actually the city with the second highest eviction rate in the United States. They also froze public housing evictions because we have limited time. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but actually a non-trivial proportion of eviction cases in the U.S. are from public housing, which is shocking because we tend to think of eviction as being a private rental market problem, and it's not. There's also many people who are evicted from public housing, which then disqualifies them from future access to housing subsidies or continued residence in public housing. There's also federal bipartisan legislation, so legislation that's been proposed that has sponsors from both the Democratic and Republican parties in the U.S. Congress. And what this legislation seeks to do is set standards for national data collection so that we do have good, reliable, comparative statistics about how common eviction is in the U.S. It also includes support for increased representation for tenants in court who are fighting eviction cases, as well as short-term financial assistance for tenants. And it also includes increased regulations for oversight of tenant screening reports. So if you win your eviction case or if you've been wrongfully filed on by your landlord, it allows you to see that report and to help correct it so that those eviction cases don't follow you. And so just in closing, I want to echo a point that Dame Louise made before, in that at least in the U.S. experience for eviction, it was really, really important to actually put a number on the number of eviction cases filed and to make that number comparative across cities and states. It wasn't enough to say a lot of people experience eviction or many eviction cases are filed. Actually having that number really shed light on a problem in a way that people could take to their local and their state and federal legislators to try to address the eviction crisis in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was most interesting. Can I just clarify something? I know we heard this, I think, when we were in Nairobi. If somebody is evicted here in the United States, is that history carried through with them?
Yes. So if you are evicted through the courts, it sort of becomes part of the public record. And routinely, if you want to rent an apartment in the United States, our landlord runs a background check. They see that you've been filed on, and they can refuse to rent to you.
You said was that you can be evicted from public housing and you're disqualified in the future from getting any kind of public housing. I mean, that's quite yes, it is a nightmare. Yeah.
It's not unusual.
Yeah.
It's not unusual.
Yeah. So I'm very impressed at the stats that you've given us, the data that you've got from 50 states. That's extraordinary. And I think, again, it's pointing out the need for the data. And, I think Unanima International certainly want to work with you in the future in terms of our research. So that was just wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to move on now to Mr. Indu Pragesh Singh. You're most welcome. You are facilitator City Makers International. Indu Pragesh Singh is a human rights defender, a poet, an author, a feminist. Your part of your background is participatory reflection and action participatory learning and action participatory rural appraisal practitioner. That sounds wonderful, and we're glad you're here with all that experience with you. You're a facilitator and currently consultant to a large number of development organisations, and you recently have been made a member of the state-level Shelter Monitoring Committee for the progress of shelters for urban homeless in Delhi. We're looking forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about that. Thank you.
First of all, a big thank you to IGH for inviting me here, and the UN, DESA, for the opportunity that you have given to some of us to talk about the work we do as such. And of course, I've been here coming to Chicago since 2015, and that's been a major, I would say, boost to the work that we've been doing in India as such. I've been working for the last 20 years, and before that 20 years, I was in the women's movement in the country. And the latest 20 years, I've been working with the homeless people in Delhi and other parts of India. And, just to tell you that, this paper is there? If we can just track that, yeah. Anyhow, I think if you can get that, it's okay. What has happened is that, like in the last 20 years of the work that we have done in India, especially Delhi and other parts, at a point we had no data as such about who the homeless are. And it's about 1999 we started the work in Delhi. And so we devised our own mechanism of doing our study, being a sociologist myself. So it was like, from about 7 o'clock in the evening until midnight, we did the surveys. And from midnight until early morning, we did the head count of the homeless people. And we counted about 52,765 people on streets of Delhi in 2000. And for us, we have a caveat that for every one that we counted, there's one missed, because in the night we couldn't go into all the lanes and by-lanes and alleys and all. There were people who still work in Delhi in the night at the trading centers, so they're not sleeping as such. So for one counted, one missed, so it's about 100,000 people who was homeless in Delhi in 2000. Yeah. I'll just come to that, So in a way, in fact, we have done similar studies in Delhi, in 2008 as well. And just want to tell you here that, like in 2008, we counted 88,410 people on the streets of Delhi. Just want to bring here this fact that it's not as though the government has not been doing these studies. We have got census happening in India every 10 years. It's a decennial census. And in 2001, when the census was happening, we were invited by census directors to come and, sensitize the enumerators, the charge officers. We did that. We volunteered to see as to how census is done and guide the census officials in 2001 and 2011. 2001, it was in Delhi. 2011 was in other parts of the country. And I must tell you here that, at least for India, and at least for the homeless people you're talking about, census is the biggest fraud that's happening in the country. And a farce. Hundreds and thousands of homeless are not even enumerated. So we counted 52,765 people in 2000. Census says some 24,966 persons are homeless. 88,410 people in 2008. Census 2011 says some 44,000 people are homeless. So obviously, in fact, Louise, when you talked about, like less data, less allocation, less funds, and less coverage. So the problem, in fact, we're talking about the challenges that we face is that Delhi also is a very, very astute governance model. It's a union territory, which means is the chief minister. Of course, we have got a new chief minister. I don't know the former chief minister, Arvind Kejriwal, is chief minister at the moment. He hasn't got the law and order with him. He hasn't got the police with him. He hasn't got the land with him. Everything belongs to central government, okay, the federal government. And I'll come to that. The problem today is that we have a federal government which is very rightist. It's a Hindu rightist government as such. And you'll be shocked to know that around 2000, we met a child. In fact, this is a story I keep telling every time. And it's since it's United Nations, I have to tell that. We asked this child what he wanted to grow up to be. As we asked, when we were young, our parents asked, or maybe our relatives asked us what you want to grow up to be. So we asked this child, and you'll be shocked. Normally I'll take 10 minutes to ask everybody else what he wanted to be and then give the answer. But I don't have time, so I just want to tell you here. He didn't want to be a Gandhi or a king or a Nelson Mandela or a police or a doctor or whatever. He wanted to be a Hitler. 8-year-old child, Hitler. He wanted to be Hitler. And for about 2 minutes, I was foxed. I couldn't realize as to what this child has said. Then just took my arms around him and said, "But child, tell me why you want to be Hitler." That 8-year-old child was, his entire face was turned with full of rage and anger. 8-year-old child, mind you, full of rage and anger. He says, in Hindi, he said, now there's no point of saying in Hindi because I think nobody will follow here. What he said was, well, I haven't started, I'm getting timely, but anyhow. So he said, that I will become Hitler and kill all the police people because I was beaten by belt and boots of the police and for 1 week I couldn't walk. If an 8-year-old child wants to be Hitler in Delhi, capital of India, you can imagine what the police does for women, elderly, disabled, mentally, and all that. Okay? And that's because we have a government, which actually is not accountable. We have bureaucracy, which is not accountable. Okay? Now, there's lots to say, but I just want to cut short, in fact, the entire thing, is that, so in that milieu, we have been working from a point when we had only barely 10 shelters for the homeless. Today we have about 272 shelters for the homeless in Delhi. Highest anywhere maybe in any city as such, But it's happened because the courts intervened. We filed public interest litigations in Delhi High Court. I'm a petitioner in Supreme Court of India for the homeless matter. We filed in 2003. It got activated in 2013. It took 10 years. When you talk about cases, it's not easy. It takes 10 years and all. So 2013 got activated because of Supreme Court coming in. In fact, today we have got shelters opening all across the country. So there's a long story, like how we, there was a master plan for Delhi being made where we represented with 7,000 homeless people signed the memorandum. The criteria came of 1 shelter per 100,000 population, because of which I think, there is a criteria which fixed that there should be 1 shelter per 100,000 urban population in Delhi as such. Just want to tell you here because I think quickly tell you that I've captured all the work on the homeless with a book called City Makers. We don't call them homeless, we call them city makers. These are the people who made the city with their sweat and labor, and they have every right to the city. You can't beat them around. You can't, just tell them criminals and, hassle them around as such. Yeah. Today, I also want to say here that the problem today in my country is we have a prime minister. And I want to tell you here because the United Nations, you should listen to it. We have a prime minister who actually, we worked all these years, in 20 years, so many shelters have come up. We want to end homelessness and, in SDGs we're talking about leaving no one behind. He's coming up with, I'll read the statement quickly because I think it'll save on time, is that the Indian government today is creating a wedge between the majority Hindu and minority communities, Muslims and Christians primarily. Citizen Amendment Act and National Register of Citizens is opposed to the Constitution of India and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Articles 1 to 30, especially Articles 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, 1 and 2, 14, 15, 1 and 2, 17, 19, 21, 23, 30 of the UDHR. They are in contravention of this UDHR, apart from the Constitution of India. Our work with the homeless in India, whom we call city makers, since 1999, has seen many High Court of India, Delhi and Mumbai, and Supreme Court of India support our work through the PILs we filed in 2001 and 2003 respectively. The current Delhi government of Arvind Kejriwal, he's of course a dear friend of ours, has supported our work, due to which we have the highest number of shelters in Delhi. The federal government, Union of India, with one stroke will nullify our over 20 years of work with the homeless, that is city makers. We believe in ending homelessness than multiplying it. In this work, we are guided by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Patrice Lumumba, and other people. And I want to tell you here quickly that we are going to have a new scenario where, apart from homelessness, ending homelessness, they would make these people stateless, put them into detention centers. What Hitler did way back in 30s in Germany, we are going to witness that in India. And maybe it's a time that we call this government and tell them, well, this is not done. I'm a Hindu. I don't want a country where Muslims and Christians are not there. So this is something which we all need to, because this is a challenge for many of us today in the country. We all, in fact, in Delhi, all over the country, we are protesting against what the federal government is doing as such. There are huge protests happening where Muslims and all of us are together there, I think together. So it's a question, I think, it's a tough scenario for many of us. And we are up against this government, which will be there for another 4.5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your passion, which you told us your story. When you talked about the census is a fraud. We could say that in many countries, because I could tell you in Ireland that unless you're lying on the ground, you're not homeless. I thought the other the story of the 8-year-old child was a horrific story to hear, and I'm sure that could be replicated for many children saying the same thing. And one of the issues that you brought out clearly is that the bureaucracy is not accountable, and I think that's just not in India either. One of the things that I was very struck with, Indu, is how you worked with the judicial system. You created change and you brought around justice, and we applaud you for that. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure again to bring the voice of the reality into this place, the lived experience of Gwendolyn Cassidy from America. Gwen creates sustainable solutions for people through her small businesses and non-profit. Having been homeless 4 times since the age of 14, twice chosen and twice forced, help create action-based results through social entrepreneurial endeavours, coupled with sharing people's stories to raise awareness to pertinent global pandemics via the production company which you lead and you're going to tell us about now. So you're most welcome, Gwendolyn, and we're looking forward to hearing your voice as well.
Thank you so much, Miss Jean Quinn. I'm so grateful to be here. I want to thank Johanna Hertz, who has made all of this possible for me, as well as Mr. Mark McGreevy, and Julia, and Dame Louise Casey, who is my newest hero, who I hope to emulate. If I could only do a fraction of the work that you have done here in the States and that you did in the UK, I would die a happy person. And most of all, Amin, thank you. This is by far the most gratifying experience of my life. Less than 10 years ago, I was living on food stamps, showering at our local homeless shelter, The Haven, in Charlottesville, Virginia. And now we are premiering right now our first documentary short called If It Could Happen to Me, It Could Happen to You, From Homeless to Harvard. It's an expository documentary on the global pandemic of homelessness with a focus on the local pandemic in the birthplace of modern democracy, Charlottesville, Virginia.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We solely publish and declare that these qualities are and of right out to be free, and independent states, and for the support of this declaration, with the firm of reliance on the protection of divine providence, we multi-pledge our lives for our fortunes and our sacred honor.
4 years I've been homeless, sleeping out here, 20-degree weather, rain, everything.
But I'll tell you what, right now, homeless right now, we don't stand a chance with nothing out here. We're poor, black, white, Mexican, Spanish, English, or national, what do we got? We ain't never going to stand a chance. We're fighting for our rights.
What do people mean when they say homeless at the UN, and how has that changed throughout the UN's history?
This is such a challenging issue because people who are homeless are eking out an existence at the intersection of many powerful forces: poverty, housing instability, loss of jobs, unemployment, violence, substance use, mental health challenges. So in order to tackle this, we need all parts of society working together to address this. It can't be from any one sector of society or one individual. These are really interdisciplinary challenges.
Homeless people are not horrible people. They're good people. They just had a bad situation happen to them.
Worst thing that ever happened to me being homeless is being homeless. Not being, being responsible, getting locked up, you know, for something stupid, stealing out of stores and stuff like that, you know. And people not want to be around you, you know, your family, you know, your friends, you know, and that's a hurting thing, you know.
The worst thing that happened to me is the streets. Being in the streets, because you don't know when or where it would take you.
These are our beautiful souls. These are human beings with hopes and dreams, and I think we just need people to realize that and to see that we're all in this together.
I was up here, like, you know, just relaxing, sleeping on the wall over there. Some kids came by and they were arguing with each other, and they started throwing rocks at each other. I got caught in the middle of it. So in retaliation, I threw a rock, but actually, you know, it wasn't a good thing to be involved in. But it came back later that night and set me on fire.
The first period of kind of mass homelessness was after the Civil War. So you had slaves that were being freed. You had the war veterans, some who came back to places that had been burned out.
1.6 billion people live with inadequate housing. Globally, 150 million people are currently experiencing homelessness. 586,000 people were homeless on any given night in the United States in 2019. In the birthplace of modern democracy, Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2013, there were 283 people who experienced homelessness. In 2018, there were 440 people who experienced homelessness.
Me, I'm sleeping in public storage. You know, that's where I was sleeping at. And then I'm working next door to the U-Haul. I mean, you know, working next door to U-Haul to make some money. But at the same time, I had counseling. At the same time, homeless, counselor, and working, you know. So they sent me down here to UVA for my counseling, but then I end up sleeping outside.
Oh, absolutely, and that's true. If it can happen to me, it can happen to you.
Thank you all very much for being our first audience for Vision Forward Media. We're very, very excited for this opportunity. I was hoping to tell His Excellency Jukka Salavara from Finland that if I ever, you know, hopefully not ever end up homeless for a fifth time, I'm going to burn my passport the second I get through customs in Finland. So I'm experiencing a serious case of imposter syndrome. I feel like a fraudulent homeless person. Although I fit the HUD technical definition of being homeless 4 times, starting at the age of 14, I was never a street child or homeless teen living in a shelter or in the streets. I always had an office, a car, or a friend's couch to live on during my times of homelessness. I've been forced into homelessness twice, and twice I chose to be home free. Unfortunately, we don't have my currently homeless friends here with us because it would be very difficult to try to get through the gates of the United Nations, given the majority of them cannot even get an ID card. Many of them suffer or have suffered from addiction issues, mental well-being issues, or they simply don't want to be found. The currently homeless are the most vulnerable of our society. 10 years ago, on my 35th birthday, my Charlottesville friends, who are no longer with us, Reds and Rah-Rah, a homeless vet who lost 2 fingers in combat, wanted to pool their food stamps to buy me a steak dinner for my birthday. People with nothing to give wanted to give me all they had, part of their $200 a month in food stamps. At that moment, I wondered outside of the library in downtown Charlottesville, how could I give back? In 2017, after witnessing the most evil things imaginable being done to innocent homeless people in the University of Virginia hospital system, where eugenics was founded and implemented, I decided to make a difference through my filmmaking. While filming, if it could happen to me, it could happen to you, from homeless to Harvard, we focused on those who couldn't be here today, the chronically homeless. This past Thanksgiving, while filming in Washington, D.C., I had the opportunity of spending time with one of my favorite homeless friends, Chris. Although people are quick to judge or claim how most currently homeless people are druggies or addicts, there are underlying reasons people utilize this coping mechanism. Chris fell into addiction issues with cocaine and ended up homeless. Due to a spinal injury from a motorcycle accident, he has nerve issues preventing him from feeling much on the right side of his body. One night in the dead of winter, he fell asleep on a grate to stay warm and only had the left side of his body covered by the heat coming from the grate. He woke up and had to go to the hospital due to frostbite, which would later become gangrene. They had to amputate his leg from the knee down. Chris holds an extra special place in my heart because of his kindness and unique spirit. Although I don't have much, technically living below the federal poverty line myself, I can always be inspired by the kindness of some of my friends despite their struggles as I fight for their rights and for those of us who are the most disenfranchised members of our global community. The night before coming up here, Chris, the gentleman who was lit on fire one night by a group of rich white kids, sent me a letter. As I was getting ready for this impending, most momentous occasion of my life, I read his letter. He wrote to tell me how since we last saw each other, he had to be hospitalized for gangrene again, and this time they had to amputate his second leg. It is my greatest hope that Chris will be my first homeless friend to be selected to live in international villas, our net positive off-grid small home community where I will be constructing small homes for less than $10,000 based on tiny home community models in Detroit and Austin, and now your hometown, Mr. Littlejohn, and other U.S. cities. It is my hope that we can be inclusive of the LGBTQI homeless community, veterans, mothers and children, and teens recently released from foster care. Through my filmmaking, I'm raising awareness to global atrocities and pandemics while cultivating new friendships along the way. Although I feel like an imposter because I've never been a street child or chronically homeless person, I am utilizing my life's experiences to hopefully help curb these societal ills. Time is the only commodity, and time is of the essence now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. And thank you for sharing Chris's story. You brought, he's in this room. And I think what I learned there was what you talked about, Tracy, about health systems. Thank you. You might take that message with you that, you know, something needs to be done in terms of the health system for people who are on the street. You know, and I think that's that inclusive model that we would like to have. And, you know, the fact that people cannot get an ID card, and I discovered that with John Sheehan a number of months ago here on the people who are on Fifth Avenue. That How can they get to any kind of system without a card? It's like Liz, your story and everything you said about your experience and what you're trying to do now is really needed. Your voice is needed, and thank you so much. Finally, and I'm sorry, we're okay, and we still have time for questions, so we're all right. But finally, it's hard to be the last one, when you're waiting along this line, is Yanela Pazente, the coordinator of the Latino Americana Street Network Project, and its secretary. Yanela is the coordinator of Proyecto Recal Latinoamericano, an action led by the Ministry of Social Development of Uruguay, together with the international organization Italo Latin American, the Ministry of Human Development and Social Inclusion of Costa Rica, and the Ministry of Social Development and the Family of Chile. The governments of Brazil, Colombia, and Paraguay participate as associate entities. Within the framework of the 2030 Agenda, these governments cooperate to share experiences and work together to strengthen national public policies for the care of people in street situations. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how that works. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today, sharing and learning with such important colleagues who work every day to improve the living conditions of homeless. First of all, I want to make a very special recognition to the Institute Global Homelessness, to the United Nations, and the NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, and to all who have worked instantly to place this issue on the 2030 Agenda and have managed to bring together civil society organizations, leaders of governments, private sector, technical teams, and researchers, because the challenges are many and everyone's input is needed. Well, the observations that I will share with you are the results of the work in the design, management, and evaluation of homeless policies implemented over the last 15 years in Uruguay by the Ministry of Social Development. I will also try to bring you the lesson learned from the construction projects of the Latin American Street Network, an action that takes its first steps in 2013 based on international cooperation initiatives, specifically with the support of the European community. In this sense, we understand that it is important scaling up cooperation practice of these 6 countries to the rest of the Latin America, and why not to other developing countries in other regions of the world. Until we are involved the governments of Brazil, Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, who is currently in charge of coordination. First, the first reflection. Have it? Well. The first item is social protection and homelessness systems. In Latin America, during the last stage of growth, the 1 decade, between the years 2003 and 2013, have generated change and advances in the fields of welfare and social protection, with a context of favorable economic growth. This stage of uninterrupted economic growth generates favorable conditions to introduce change in social dimensions. In this context, Latin America began a process to reducing socioeconomic vulnerability that has been evaluated at the fastest and the most pronounced since data is known. This growth contributed to moderate poverty levels and was accompanied by a series of very important social reforms of labor regulation and reduction of income concentration. The Uruguayan case as an example. Here, in the day, I think, yes. Sorry. This is the 2020 carpets. 13 February. Well, our indicators of people below the poverty line and household under LP, extreme poverty and Gini index have very increased and reduced enormously the poverty. However, enormous challenges remain. The historical delay in the welfare state generated incomplete states, with heterogeneous development in Latin American countries. The best case we can find the construction of dual and stratified systems, which offer lower quality service and benefit for the most vulnerable people by assigning them to the social assistance circuits where social inclusion is presented as a chimera. Well, after. Ya hablé de todo. These are the indicators of a case of Uruguay, and you can see the reduction of positive indicators, but will still remain homeless people that the last data for the last years count is that 2,038 people in street situation. Well, in sum, the one decade in Latin America has shown us that despite the efforts made with the structural reforms carried out, they showed positive results, but they have not been sufficient to strengthen social protection systems. According to the experience of the Latin American Street Network, it is clear that beyond the problem of homelessness, it is present in all the world. Each country gives different answers according to the scope of its social protection system. Undoubtedly, homelessness is not the same in Paraguay, where, for example, there is no free access to medical care, than in Uruguay, where this right is guaranteed for the entire population. The 2030 Agenda with the social development goals help states to review and align their development policies with a more inclusive multidimensional approach, which realizes the importance of strengthening social protection floors so that everyone contributes according to their possibilities and receive benefits according to their needs throughout the life cycle. It is not possible to address homelessness only from care policy. It is necessary at the same time to reduce inequality, poverty, and strengthen the systems. The question is, before? Yes? The question is, how to do in the current economic retraction context. They more than ever, social investments must be a priority. And we need a civil society demanding this to the political leaders. Well, the second reflections. Change in the homeless paradigm. From a Street Network and from the Mides, is proposed to understand and address homelessness as opposed to the more traditional visions that focus on individual reasons and seek exclusively to act on the behavior of the subject. It is essential to modify the way in which this problem is looked at. So far, the responses of public policies and civil society mostly focus on addressing the terrible consequence of living on the street. This leads to focusing the cause of the homelessness on the subject and on their maladaptive behaviors and not on the structural causes. Therefore, it is necessary to achieve greater articulation of the social welfare policy with the provision of housing, with employment policies, with access to public goods and service. It is proposed to overcome the old dichotomy that leads to consider the excluded as worthy and unworthy of being attended to consolidate a universal public policy based on the right of citizens. Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay have initiated an innovation process, implemented last year proposal for housing-centered policies based on the housing first model. These are pictures of the two projects in Uruguay, project Incubar and Alzheimer project. So that it's possible to make innovations. Third, more social participation, more research. Homelessness is present in development and in developing countries. It is a clear example of how we have not been able to adequately address one of the most severe expressions of the exclusion in contemporary societies. With the street network, we have taken a real dimension of the complexity of this problem. We need better public policies, and for that, it is necessary to strengthen the link between government and social participation and amplify the voice of those who suffer from this problem. The 6 countries present case of good practice in this dimension. And finally, a mention of the need of the Latin American Academy to be strengthened. It is necessary to generate evidence and greater knowledge about homelessness from our countries and put in dialogue with policy design. Thank you. This is a photograph.
I think what's coming clearly from your presentation, Yanel, from my point of view, is that the need for the count and the need for the definition as well, because it underlies everything else. I thought the collaboration among the Latin American networks it's most interesting. At one level, it's very positive, and at another level, it's very challenging. And you brought that out very clearly, and it depends which country you're in. I thought looking to align the medical systems, and I think we're hearing that this afternoon, and it's part of the overall issues that we need to do something about. And we have to, in order to reduce poverty, we need to strengthen systems. And I think you're very, very clear on that. Thank you very much indeed. It was most interesting. Thank you. So now I'm very anxious to have this open conversation that I said at the beginning at 3 o'clock, and it's now just 5:35. So I'm sure there are people here burning to have a conversation with these wonderful people that are on the panel this afternoon. And I feel very enriched by it, and I'm looking forward to some more conversation. So please, when you speak, will you say who you are and where you're coming from? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, dignitaries, and panelists. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Valentin Camano, Youth Representative, Delegations Overseas Outreach for Man Up Campaign. And my question to whomever wished to respond, Finland is a prime example of housing. I have seen their videos, their trainings, their pilots, their data and statistics, and has been amazing from a youth perspective. And I'm still learning in the process. Yes. I live in here currently in New York City, and I have seen gentrification from Harlem to Brooklyn, to literally West 4th Street, nearby NYU, in the Bronx, Grand Concourse, Hunts Point. And my question is, youth need not just education and financial infrastructure frameworks. They also need education, regardless of different sectors, in different backgrounds. If they're still in school, I know the USA covers for some of those expenses in terms of education and support, but we need more. How can other countries support each other in terms of supporting youth? Because they also need mental coaching to avoid, such as, for example, as Madam Louise Cassidy mentioned, youth need support as well, because we were not trying to do the same mistakes as our predecessors did previously. So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's great that the youth are represented by yourself here today, so I'm delighted. Could I hand that question over to you, Mark, to talk about Finland and housing, and you talked about how the youth needs education, and I guess it's around some of these issues.
Well, in what you said there, when you talked about gentrification of buildings and things like that, we could talk forever about what's Airbnb done, to the price of properties in some of our major cities that we're going to. On youth, it's interesting, and it goes back to this question that was said, which is, it's not just about housing, it's this intergenerational poverties and the way that people get sucked in. It's about so much more. And I always reflect on the fact that I meet very few rich homeless people. Very few rich homeless people. You would think if it was proportionate, you would meet a fair few rich people on the streets as well. And it suggests to me that, yes, and the money doesn't buy everything, but what it does suggest to me is that we need this holistic package from what used to be called in the UK a policy called Sure Start, that almost started with children as they were born and supported them and gave them those kind of tools and resources going through. But I think that more than that, we can encourage policymakers to think this way. Good examples that you see, and you bump into them all the time around the world in terms of how we support youth. We could probably do offline, if that's okay, because we could get into a very long debate about this, but you can have my email address to directly some programs that DePaul UK and Ireland and other subsidiaries around the world are doing. But you're right. You're right to say it starts with youth. That's where we can begin this prevention. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. So, any other questions? John, would you mind say who you are?
Hi, John Sheen. I run an outreach program. Yesterday, I went to work. Back and I wasn't here. And during the day, I saw, and I'm going to ask my friend from London this question. I saw two people. One was from a woman from El Salvador who was escaping violence and gangs in El Salvador, and another man who was Russian, who's lived on the streets in New York probably for 13 years. He has no status here. And that's my question, is that the feeling of the lack of belonging of people who live on the street. About 30% of the people I help are non-citizens. So, we talk about human rights. We have to have universal human rights. And regretfully, in our country, as you were critical of yours, I'll be critical of mine. We are going backwards, not forward, in a dramatic way. How did you handle that issue in the UK in terms of people who were non-citizens who were homeless?
Me?
Yes.
Yes. So I really loathe the expression non-citizens. It just doesn't illegal is I don't know, in a funny kind of way you can call illegal. You know what I mean? You can call it for what it is, because you're essentially saying somebody is illegal, they're criminal. A non-citizen is denying somebody their right to be alive. Do you know what I mean? It's a really awful expression. And we struggle at home with it as well. So my pragmatic side, as somebody that has worked for politicians for a while, so the really interesting thing about what's happening in the United Kingdom 2 weeks post-Brexit is that for the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen the number of people who are economic migrants come across and come to London specifically, but also many other areas. And they come with the promise of a job. It's organised. And then when they arrive, that job just isn't there, and they've paid their money to somebody to come on the coach, get off at Victoria coach station, and then they walk essentially into places like the Passage, which is a day centre that Mark and I have both volunteered in when we were children. And so what's really interesting now is I think the government, post-Brexit, will want to reduce the number of people sleeping on the streets for political reasons, and I hope it goes beyond politics as well. But they'll have to deal with the fact that we have people that are not British citizens who are sleeping on the streets. And if they want, we count them, you see. So we know every month in Westminster and Camden the numbers of people and where they come from. So when we go and talk to the government and they say, you ought to be solving homelessness, we go, yeah, that kind of starts with you. Because if you don't accept that we need to do something with and for these people, then you will continue to have a homelessness problem. So we put right in the spotlight some of these very difficult issues, which is bloody uncomfortable for the government, but really helpful in terms of focusing their minds. And I think it's something I was really struck, Ashley, by hearing that presentation again and realising that over here in this extraordinarily, obviously clever individual that we've got, what you have done is put the spotlight on something which no politician can walk away from. And I think we can do that around some of this non-citizen crap as well, actually. That's the way to deal with it. Deal with it through hard data and hard fact. And you know, right now, our government has paused on essentially trying to deport EU citizens. They're having a bloody good job at being racist around some other citizens, but on the EU side, it's something called derogation. So essentially we're accepting responsibility that EU citizens that currently live in the UK who are homeless are ours, and they are our responsibility. And I think if the sector hadn't collected that data and, you know, cooperated with that data, and we had the balls to ask people where they were from, and to talk about ethnicity, to talk about where people come from, to name it, it meant that we've got something, and that's power. Information is power. So, you know, I mean, good for you for running services that serve and support those people. Better in the United Nations that we have everybody being a citizen. So you're in the right place today, sir.
Could I also, there was a second part to that question, and you asked about what is the feeling of the lack of belonging, what that's like. Would you like to say something about that, Liz? Yeah, just want to put you on the air.
The feeling of belonging. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult place to be. And essentially, it goes back a little bit, I think, to self-responsibility. And it's hard. I know sometimes people say, oh, you know, people need support from external structures, but there has to be an element of self-responsibility, and that's timing, and it's different for every individual. And I guess it's just about services, having the patience, or family members, just being patient and just waiting for that person to reach that moment, because, like, it's all coming from yourself. You know, really. So the sense of belonging actually is your own journey, and accepting yourself, because once you're okay with yourself, you do feel like you belong. So yeah, I think it's, you know, the belonging is probably, for me at least anyway, my experience was starting with myself, and then once I felt like I deserved support, I started to reach out and receive that. So.
Belonging part, I just want to say here that, you know, in our night walks that we used to normally organize, which is from about 9 o'clock in the night till early morning, we do these night vigils in Delhi, you know, for last many years. So we would come across police guys beating the homeless up, and the homeless would see the police, and there are hundreds of sleeping, and they all are running away. So when the police had gone, so we went up to this person and said, listen, you are hundreds of you sleeping here. Why don't you challenge these guys? You have a right to sleep here. Okay? They can't be bashing up like that. You know what he said? Very important thing, that behind the stick of the police, the entire force of this country is there, and behind all hundreds of us, there's nobody. Now that, I think that says that existential angst is there, And just the reverse of it, I would say we have come across the homeless children. They bond together well. They might fight with each other, but when it comes to taking care of each other, they are great friends, So I think that belongingness is like cooking together, eating together. If they get food somewhere, they'll collect the food and give to the other friend who's not got the food. So I think maybe that's what we need to just create those, subcultures and all which are there. It is not criminal. It's how people see it actually, So I think the spaces are there. But of course, with the adult people, the problem which I said was there, that they face a lot of challenges as such. Yeah, they like it.
Thank you, Indu. Do we have another one or two questions?
Margaret Wally. I'm with Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People. And my question is more for Gwen. Thank you. My question would be more for Gwen. I'm wondering, I think you bring to the table a very unique lived experience. And so I'm wondering, what would be the takeaway from your lived experience, perhaps that you could share with this body, that would be something helpful for us to keep in mind moving forward, basically listening to the voice of somebody that has experienced what we've been talking about over the past few days. Thank you.
All white, all Christian town, home of the only Bentley Rolls-Royce dealership in the Midwest. It attracted a certain rich white psychopathology in the 70s and 80s where there was no regulations. And my mother began prostituting me at the age of 4. I was first trafficked back from Chicago at the age of 8 and was brought back to my elementary school as a 9-year-old in 4th grade. When she sold me at the Bloomingdale's Miracle Mile Clinique makeup counter. But I experienced homeless people throughout that and all of those very scary, very real experiences. That's my underlying driving force for my work. And I experienced mainly, Wheeler Mission is the largest and was one of the largest and oldest homeless agencies based in Indianapolis. People disappear all the time, and there are some truly sick people on this planet. I'm also probably the only person on the planet who went from living as the governess for late King Abdullah and late Crown Prince Naif of Saudi Arabia's families on their royal compound to becoming homeless within 5 months after earning 6 figures cash. Because I, too, like many Americans, got caught up in the housing market collapse. Ironically, I would nanny for Phil Falcone, one of the individuals responsible for the housing market collapse. And while he was giving his wife a $175,000 purse one night, I was thinking, that's my entire house. And my house just disappeared overnight, essentially. And then I also then went to was selected after becoming homeless after living on this Royal Saudi compound, becoming homeless due to my Sotheby's realtor allowing estranged family members into my home to essentially steal my life. I lived out of offices on the downtown mall in Charlottesville, Virginia to get my life back together, and then was selected to live in a World UNESCO Heritage Site, the only university on the planet to be a World UNESCO Heritage Site, the University of Virginia. I became very close friends with somebody very high up in maintenance. I will not say his name to protect him, but what he witnessed UVA doing, I also, this is not a proper venue to be discussing that, but in any event, I also interviewed with Melania Trump in 2012 when I was a homeless person. I was couch surfing with a friend in Harlem, and I think that, too, is very indicative of the society we live in. What most people don't realize is that 40% of the American population is one paycheck away from becoming homeless. I had the opportunity to interview the former mayor of my hometown, Charlottesville, Virginia, and he also, as the mayor of one of the most affluent communities in America, admitted in our filming that he too was one paycheck away from from homelessness in America. So that's the plight that we live in. That's a society that we live in, and I mean, I don't know where to begin to start cleaning it up. Thank you.
I'm Thomas. I represent the Salesian Missions, and interestingly, our organization was started 150 years ago in Turin, precisely to take care of the homeless youth during the Industrial Revolution who came onto the streets. So having said that, in several of the meetings many of the side events I attended, I've listened to what homelessness is, how it takes place, how big the problem is, and probably not sufficiently why it takes place. Why is homelessness there? Especially when you look at, a period when Europe, the global north had very little homelessness, and the global south. In both places, this homelessness is increasing day by day. And though someone did say that probably inequality is not the reason, I do believe the driving inequality, a developmental model that drives development are all the same engines also drive inequality. And if you don't really come on the same page about that, we are thinking about, partnership to address homelessness, there will be very little that we can really do. It is not really about finding finances, resources to build more homes, etc. Why does in the first place people are, pushed out into the streets?
Can I just ask you?
Could we just respond to that a little bit? And,
Thomas, do you have a question?
The why of homelessness, what do you think, yeah? And how do you build partnership if we are on the same page about that?
I haven't heard anything this afternoon that says that we don't think that inequality is a driving force behind homelessness. I don't think I've heard that this afternoon. It's obviously part of what drives homelessness. Poverty is to put it really simply, Mark summed it up, on the whole, very few people with a lot of money in their pocket who are homeless. So it's obviously a major factor. I think you're referring to a conversation this morning with Frake, from the kind of leading individual from the European Union. And what Frake is saying is we need to be clever about what is driving homelessness in different cultures, in different places, in different nationalities. I don't think he was saying, what he was doing was posing some tough questions. So, for example, one European country that has 30% social housing, which is great, also has a rising tide of homelessness. So what he was trying to do was make us think in a very powerful way. So I think it's the Czech Republic that he was referring to, where the median income, in terms of inequality speak, as it were, in legislation, language, is pretty good, yet it has a big homelessness problem. So I think all he was trying to do, and I thought he did it really well, was say, let's have a bloody good think about what we think is driving homelessness. But, Thomas, it's clear that inequality in its basic form is one of the reasons why homelessness exists. And Amanda Andera put it so powerfully in terms of, certainly in the United States, just an extraordinary racial dimension to that here. So I don't think anybody's disagreeing with you.
Okay, and maybe sadly we've come to the end of this afternoon. I think what's striking me is that all of you have stayed the course of 3 hours, and I do believe that, I mean, it's a historic moment in the history of the United Nations that we are speaking about homelessness, and it will go on for a long time to come. I think before we finish, do we have a video just to finish, please? And that will be the end of the session, and it's my pleasure to say thank you to our contributors here who've really enhanced the afternoon.